So I had an interaction with a family member this winter that was kind of strange. And even though it was something small, it was so representative of the kind of minor but significantly weird things that keep happening in my life. So let me give you some context. As you might know, our family moved to Fort Collins nearly 2 years ago in June 2020 in the heart of early pandemic times. So this was like Clorox wiping down the cereal boxes, letting the mail sit out for a day before touching it, kind of early pandemic times. We really didn't know what was going on yet. And like, we didn't go inside a single building on our drive between Minneapolis and Fort Collins, but don't think too hard about what that might imply. Anyway, a few months later, in fall 2020, my parents also moved here. We had a very intentional plan to live close to each other in order to offer each other mutual support and to enjoy life together. I had not lived in the same state as my parents since I left home at age 18. So this was a big shift. This was new territory. My entire experience of living in Fort Collins, including my experience as a minister at Foothills, my experience living in the same town as my family, my social experience, everything has occurred in a pandemic context. And because we have some high risk people in our family, the patterns that we laid down during those times looked like only visiting each other while wearing masks outdoors, or grandparents helping my kids with homework over Zoom. And so then you fast forward to this past winter, just a few months ago, my family and I were at my parents' house for dinner. And this felt so good. This seemed like a miracle to share a meal together, indoors, to sit on the couch, to feel myself surrounded by objects and decorations that felt so familiar. It was like getting a big hug that I didn't realize I needed so badly. And then I realized that this was the first time in over a year of living in the same place that we had ever had dinner at my parents' house. We had been in a pod together. My children had gone over to their house alone multiple times, but we had not gone over there as a family for dinner. And I think that there was one reason for this, and one reason only. Up until that day, it had simply never occurred to us. And then I had this second revelation that it had never occurred to me that I could invite them over to my house for dinner. Even though we had recently acquired a large dining room table expressly for that purpose, in my mind, that was still just a someday that I was waiting around for. So, the whole point of us making this big move to Fort Collins, this big sacrifice, was to be together. And it was undeniable that my imaginative capacity regarding what was possible in this newfound togetherness, it was really blocked. This felt like a kind of atrophy of the imagination. I had gotten so used to all the strange new socially distanced ways of being together that I had kind of forgotten about the basics of what's possible in human togetherness, like sharing a meal inside with your family. And it's not that I don't want to do things like this. And the irony is that I still spend a lot of time thinking about how much I long to be with people. And I want to go out and do all the things I used to do and have all the people over. I want to get to know you, the people at Foothills, so much better. And I find myself just unthinkingly sticking to my socially distanced ways. And this social and imaginative atrophy has been one of the multiple ambiguous losses that I have experienced in this pandemic. Ambiguous loss is a loss that remains unclear and without a sense of resolution. And though we may long for it, with ambiguous loss, that sense of resolution may never be achieved. For example, ambiguous loss occurs when someone is still physically present but psychologically gone, or the reverse, someone still feels psychologically present with us even though they are physically gone. It could be a loss without official verification, such as somebody going missing, or it could look like estrangement from a family member. These ambiguous losses, what they have in common is that they have no ritual markers, no cultural recognition, and this can make them especially isolating and disorienting. Like, there's no way to get your arms around these kinds of losses. There's nothing to hold on to, nothing to validate your experience or to guide you. For Pauline Boss, the theorist who first coined the term ambiguous loss, the COVID-19 pandemic has generated many ambiguous losses in ways that have been both extreme and also very subtle. You could say that ambiguous loss has been a hallmark of this pandemic. So here are some examples. The loss of the ability to be in community as we mourn deaths and celebrate major life transitions. The loss of a sense of safety regarding your health and the health of those you love. Loss of confidence in leaders and authorities. Loss of confidence in fellow citizens' willingness to look out for the greater good. Losses of learning in children. Losses of large group gatherings that bring joy and connection. Here in Colorado, the wildfires that we have endured over the last 2 years have not only brought losses of property, but losses in those natural areas we hold dear and losses to our sense of safety and security. And then there's the loss of being in community in simple, easy, and familiar ways. And even though things are so much more better than they were, and in so many ways we're kind of approximating back to normal, there's still a lot to navigate and just so many decisions still. Are you vaccinated? Should we hug? Are we shaking hands? How's the ventilation in this place? How will what I'm doing right now impact high-risk people in my bubble? And what do I do with all this kind of copious and ambiguous information about a possible recent exposure to COVID? It's really hard to figure out. And then there might also just be extra layers of challenge and ambiguity around major life losses that have transpired during the pandemic, like a divorce, a job loss, serious illness, or death. When we experience loss, we often long for resolution, for that thing that people talk about called closure that I'm not really sure is real. The idea of closure often remains elusive, even in the most stark and straightforward of circumstances. As far as I can tell, we don't get over major losses. We learn to live with them. And over time, we see that the waves of pain and grief, they get spaced out further and further, and we can feel their intensity decrease over time. But with ambiguous loss, we are experiencing grief for which we are really unprepared. Unprepared as individuals, and we're unprepared as a society to handle. Grief that we might not even have a name for, grief that doesn't quite have a place. And so that impulse towards resolution might feel especially frustrating. We might find ourselves desperate for clarity, for a timeline, so we can know what to expect and we'll know how and when we will move on from this. Or we might find ourselves just waiting and waiting around for things to get back to normal. And we just realize we're putting our lives on pause indefinitely. The truth about ambiguous loss, as with all loss, is that there is no going back to our life from before. And whatever future we had imagined and expected before the loss, it's not going to happen. And try as we might, we cannot force it into being. Our lives will keep unfolding into the future in their way, shaped by these things that have happened or things that have not happened, shaped by us and by systems and by luck and change and mystery. And so the question is, how do we navigate loss in our personal lives and in our communal life and regenerate life, vitality, and joy? And specifically, what does regeneration look like in this context of the multiple ambiguous losses we've accrued by this point through living through COVID-19? One tool Pauline Boss suggests. Pauline Boss is our theorist who created the term ambiguous loss. Something she suggests is both and thinking, holding and honoring two contradictory truths at the same time. With ambiguous loss, this can take our focus off of waiting for resolution and getting relief through some idea of perfect closure. And instead, it helps us regenerate our lives and continue moving along our life path by naming what is real and helping us to see that there's more than one possibility for truth. And this can be so helpful with our imaginative atrophy, this both and thinking. When there is more than one truth at hand, the possibilities for moving forward multiply and we gain momentum. It's like the scope of our vision is amplified. Both and thinking is an intellectually honest way to help us get less stuck. So here are some pandemic both ands for me. This has been a hard time, and this has been a time of growth. This has been a time of sacrifice, and this has been a time of abundance. I'm sad about my child's academic losses from virtual school, and that challenge helped us better understand how to support her learning. Caregiving in my family during the pandemic has been exhausting and consuming, and caregiving in my family has been a source of meaning and connection. I miss the uncomplicated social events from before COVID, and I am enjoying the company of people in my life right now, and I continue to feel my way into new modes of togetherness. To quote Carl Jung, only the paradox comes anywhere near to comprehending the fullness of life. When we engage in both and thinking, we are embracing the wisdom of the paradox, something that seems contradictory but is actually true. The paradox is a spiritual reality that humans have revered across time and culture. So I want to invite us now to hold this both and thinking, to hold this notion of paradox in our hands for a moment, or maybe you just want to put it in your pocket. Hold it as one tool for regenerating our lives in the wake of pandemic ambiguous loss. And if you want to just forget about it entirely, that's okay too, because I will remind you about it later. So I don't want you to stress. I want to share a second tool for coping with grief and loss. And I could use my own words for this, but Barbara Kingsolver describes it so beautifully in her essay, High Tide at Tucson. So I'll use her words instead. Barbara Kingsolver writes the following: each one of us is called upon, probably many times, to start a new life. A frightening diagnosis, a marriage, a move, a loss of job or limb or loved one, a graduation, bringing a new baby home. It's impossible to think at first how this all will be possible. Eventually, what moves it all forward is the subterranean ebb and flow of being alive among the living. King Solver continues, in my own worst seasons, I've come back from the colorless world of despair by forcing myself to look hard for a long time at a single glorious thing. A flame of red geranium outside my bedroom window, and then another, my daughter in a yellow dress, and another, the perfect outline of a full dark sphere behind the crescent moon, until I learned to be in love with my life again. Like a stroke victim, retraining new parts of the brain to grasp lost skills, I have taught myself joy over and over again. I love this. Looking hard at a single glorious thing as a way of learning to be in love with life again. Teaching yourself joy through noticing beauty over and over again. I have been drawn to this practice by beholding beauty and aliveness lately in a place that might sound obvious, but I know is actually a pretty unlikely place, which is my backyard. It is a mess. And I want to acknowledge that this is not the first, but the second messy ministerial backyard to make it into a sermon on this in this series on regeneration. Reverend Gretchen talked about hers a couple of weeks ago, but it is the place that is teaching my soul right now. So at first glance, in my backyard, there are not a lot of glorious things to behold right now. I see a lot of kid toys strewn across the yard. I see places where the fence is broken. The cracking paint is everywhere. And everything living in the yard needs to be trimmed back. But I haven't brought myself to do it yet. And so the unintended but beautiful impact of not tending to my yard is that I'm starting to see all these green plants spring up out of the ground and just overtake the dry deadness left over from last year. And there's one plant in particular, I think it's maybe some kind of lily, like a daylily or something. And the green sprouts are so bold and unapologetic in their vigor, and it kind of looks like hair standing on end. And then last year's remains are just lying there, hay colored on the ground, totally fine with seeding last year's territory to this new crop of green growth. And I go out and just behold this overlay of life and death every day lately. It's exactly what I need to see right now, over and over again. The husks of last year's garden sitting quietly, while the glossy newness of this year's plant overtakes them. This is the embodiment of the both and of life, dead and alive. Last year's plant is both gone and still there. Life ends and life goes on. Things change and things stay the same. Something or someone can be both here and not here, with us and gone at the same time, both and. And this very unique combination of beholding one glorious thing and practicing this both and mentality, it is everywhere in the world right now. Well, not in the world, but here in the Northern Hemisphere, in this springtime landscape. We're just surrounded by it. In the stark branches of leafless trees that are covered in tiny buds. In the flower bed covered with dead leaves. In the green and brown lawn. I see it in the child who is so grown up and yet still so incredibly young. And it's my challenge to us to go out and find beauty in the world. Notice it, behold it, reverence it. And then Let it teach us about the both and, about regenerating our lives after loss. The story does not have to be tidy and resolved and binary in order to be true. Invite your observations, your noticings, invite it to show you that everything living will die, and the force of life will knock us down with its power. Invite your observations to inform your own life. I seem to have forgotten how to invite my own family over for dinner, and I know they'll be ready when I finally invite them. Invite your observations to inform your community life. We are losing parts of this church building that we've known and loved, and we are building a place that will support our mission in new and powerful ways. When we notice what is alive and beautiful through small, consistent observations, we get fresh instructions each time in regeneration and new inspiration for falling in love with life, which is so worthy of our love despite all the hardship. And in this springtime season of rebirth, may we be especially aware of the both and of living and dying, reminding us to hold multiple truths and honor multiple possibilities and trust in our own deeply embedded resilience. Keep looking, keep beholding, keep reverencing life even when it's feeling hard and stuck and impossible. New possibilities await. Amen.